Happy Monday, crafty friends. It's release day at Pinkfresh Studio, and I have a couple of cards to share with you using some of this new product in today's YouTube video. Up first, we are going to check out a card featuring our new Today is Special stamp, stencil, and die. As you can see, I am going to be heat embossing the floral image for this card. So I have applied some anti-static powder to my white cardstock, and then I'm using my stamp press tool to get a nice good impression. I typically do stamp 2 or 3 times with embossing ink just because I'm a light stamper and I just feel like I need that to get a good impression. So for this card, I am heat embossing in Wow Gold Pearl embossing powder. It is this fantastic, really light gold. It's kind of more of a yellow tone. I just love it, and I don't know that it shows up super well in video, but it will show up a little bit better in the photos, and it's just a lovely light gold. So if you're looking for a nice light gold embossing powder, I highly suggest it. So I've really sped up the ink blending because really that's all we're doing here, is we are taking the stencil set. This is a 7-piece stencil set, and I know that seems like a lot of stencils, but I think as we get to the end of this, you'll see why we opted to do so many stencils. We really wanted you to be able to color the florals in different colors, and some of them are a little close together, so we did have to separate those stencils out. So now we're getting into more of the details on the image, and I've broken out my cute little detail brushes from Pinkfresh. These aren't available yet, but they will be very, very soon. We're just waiting for our shipment to come in. So here's hoping that they will be available in the February release. Fingers crossed, friends. Hopefully you are catching all of the colors that I'm using for the ink blending, but of course I will have a complete supply list linked in the video description below. So that if you want to shop for any of the products I'm using today, they're easily accessible. So we're just continuing on ink blending here. You'll notice I'm using an array of brush sizes, and I just use really what I think is best for that stencil. Sometimes I like to have those little small brushes for doing more details, but when I'm doing larger areas, sometimes it's nice just to get good coverage, quick coverage with the larger brushes. So once again, in this stencil set, there are 2 where you will kind of use multiple colors. And that's when I tend to break out these smaller brushes like this, because then it's a little bit easier to get in and do the separate colors and not have them mix too much. Now, the colors I'm using, Mermaid Cove and Evergreen, they aren't going to create a icky or a muddy color if they kind of combine or blend together here and there. So I'm not worried about masking or anything like that. If you weren't using colors that were complementary, or if you were using colors that you know will blend together and make a brown, I would definitely suggest using a little bit of masking tape. So there is our Today is Special image, all done and ink blended. So now we are going to move on to the sentiment. This is from the same stamp set, and I am heat embossing it to just a scrap piece of cardstock in kind of a shade of teal. And I am going to heat emboss this in white. Now, my go-to white embossing powder is Wow. It's a long name. Opaque, bright white, super fine embossing powder. Happens to be my favorite one. So, and then we are just going to heat set it. And now it is time to do some die cutting. Once again, I am really speeding up the die cutting because it's kind of a lot of die cutting, and you don't need to see me painstakingly tape down each die. But I wanted to leave it in just so you can see all of the different dies we have in this set. So, of course, we've got the big die that cuts out the florals, and don't forget there's little chads within there that they cut out as well. Now, there's also a die to cut out that sentiment, and look at how intricate and special it is. So I also die cut that sentiment out a few more times from the matching teal cardstock so that I could stack and layer it. Now, here we are to probably what is one of my favorite products from this release. This is our new spiral circle die. It's a 3-piece die, and I am just using the inner die. So basically just the design piece. So not the pieces that would cut it out in full, but I am using it to create this really, really fun background. I think the reason why this standalone die is probably one of my favorite things from the release is just because there's so many ways to use it. It gives your cards this really fun modern feel. And I just feel like it's a die that you can reach for time and time again. I have a feeling in the coming months, I am going to use this die a lot. And so hopefully you don't tire of it. I love it so much, though. You're going to see it again for the next card. But just look at how fun the background is that this die creates. I just love it. I'm super excited about how this die turned out. When I first saw the mock-up for it, I just about squealed. Okay, so now basically what you need to put this card together is some ivory glitter cardstock, all of the pieces you just created, and some jewels. I did jewels in Peach Fuzz, Ballet Slipper, and Ocean Breeze. And here is the finished card. So you might notice I didn't do the whole process. The reason being for that is I typically create samples on Pinkfresh Studio time, but this is a personal video. So I did the video on my own time. So I just, I'm giving you just some tips here for how to create the card, but I feel like you get a really good look at how to use the products, and then you have the photos if you want to replicate the card in full. And it's just probably the best use of my time. Okay, on to card number 2. This time we are going to take a peek at the new Inky Bouquet stamp, stencil, and die. I'm doing the same thing. We are going to heat emboss it. This is Hammermill 100-pound smooth white cardstock. I used it on the first card as well. And we are just going to ink it up with some embossing ink and get it covered in some embossing powder. For this card, I am going to be using the Brutus Monroe Gilded embossing powder. It is kind of my go-to gold. This is just a good standard gold. It's not as light as the gold is that I used in the first card. But it still has a really lovely gold finish when it's fully heat set. I like that it doesn't have a tendency to photograph brown the way that some embossing powders do. It's just a really nice true gold that I love. So we are moving on to the ink blending. And same as before, I am just ink blending from stencil to stencil in in Pinkfresh Studio inks. In full disclosure, when you see the finished card at the end, I actually inversed the floral colors on this one. So the card sample is going to be just a little tiny bit different from what I ink blended here in the video. Not a big deal. And the awesome thing is after this, I have another Inky Bouquet that I can use for a different card, and it will look a little bit different. So I love the vase in this, but I do feel like that little leaf kind of gets in the way. We kept them on the same stencil. So I did like to add a little bit of masking tape to help cover up just that little area where the blue and the green can overlap. Now, blue and green don't make a bad color, so not a big deal if you get a little bit of the color in there, but I really did want to keep them kind of separate from one another. So easy peasy, just grab a piece of tape. That's just some post-it tape that I used to do the masking there. So you'll notice I pulled out my small brushes again. That's just because we're doing some detail layers and some smaller layers, and I really like the control that these smaller brushes give you in these layers that have just the more small detail areas. So, like I said, fingers crossed that these small detail brushes will be available in our February release, because they are 100% fabulous and I think you're going to love them. Okay, it is time to stamp the sentiment. We're going to do two sentiments from this stamp set. Up first is this really dainty, lovely thank you sentiment. I am just inking it up in some detail black ink. Typically, I get a pretty good impression the first time. I think in the end I did end up stamping that one twice just because I am a little bit of a light stamper. So then we are going to stamp a secondary sentiment and heat emboss it on some pink cardstock this time. This one says, "You are the best." And I'm just going to heat emboss it in some white embossing powder this time. I'm going to stick with that same white embossing powder that I used in the first part of the video. It's that Wow Super Fine, the really long word. And then we are going to go ahead and heat set it with a heat tool. Now, the next steps for this card is a lot of die cutting. So you'll notice that I embossed that kind of in the middle of that chunk of pink cardstock. And that's because I knew that I wanted to die cut it with one of our label frames. Now, I like to use a little small die cut machine when I'm die cutting small pieces, just to save wear and tear on my cutting plates for my bigger machines. So just a little tip, if you have one of those little die cut machines, that's really nice for cutting out little sentiments. I would have even done this one if I hadn't done them together. And when I did actually use the small machine to cut out a couple of additional layers of that thank you die so that I could stack and adhere them at the end of the card. Okay, we are back to Spiral Circle. So here you're going to get to see Spiral Circle when you use all three of the dies together. Now, I want to give you a little bit of information about my die cut machine. So I was able to cut the Spiral Circle die without a metal shim. However, it is very intricate. So if you are struggling to get it to cut through, I would go ahead and add that metal shim in there, and it should cut perfectly fine after that. So we have all of our pieces that we just stamped, stenciled, die cut, etc. And in the end, this is the final card. I like that the Spiral Circle looks a little bit like a doily in the background that your vase of flowers is sitting on. And I did embellish it with the jewels again, this time just in Ballet Slipper and Peach Fuzz. Now, this is our new 2-in-1 embellishment tool that has not released yet. It's going to actually be released to Create and Connect event kits first, and then it will release after that. But I just wanted to show it off because it's so pretty. All right, those are my cards today. So there is a blog hop going on, lots of prizes, lots of inspiration. All the links you need will be in the video description below. So link to the new release, link to the blog hop, and all that fun stuff. So thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed my cards, and I'll see you next time.